Thank you all for tuning in, and I'm really looking forward to getting your thoughts. This paper was written a little while ago, and it's been interesting for me to go back and read it. I never normally read what I've written. It's kind of agony to have to read what you've written before, but it's also a surprise. And so I've just picked out a few things that have struck me. I'm not going to give a long summary of the article. You're perfectly capable of reading that and having done that yourselves, but I just wanted to pick out a few points that struck me, and that might be some interesting things that we can all discuss. And some of them are areas where I think we may do more work, maybe together on this project or in our own work. I start by saying very briefly that I think it's important to think about the types of countries that one's talking about when you're talking about no religion countries or religious countries. And I sort of hint at a categorization, most simply between post-Christian countries, or countries that used to be Christian and are decreasingly Christian as no religion grows, and no religion countries that were never Christian. So in the post-Christian countries, one category is countries that were communist, and those countries had a very forceful political secularization taking place. It became very costly to be religious, and so there was an accelerated secularization in many of those countries, and that has stayed in some countries, like East Germany. Not all. Some have re-sacralized. Russia to some extent has. So there are the communist post-Christian countries, and then there are the liberal democratic post-Christian countries. And my main example is Britain, which has just become a no religion majority country, having been Christian for 2,000 years, not quite that long, 1,700 years or something like that. So that's the first category, the formerly Christian countries that become no religion. And then there are some countries that never were Christian, but have a no religion majority. And China is by far the biggest no religion country in the world. The vast majority of Chinese people say they have no religion. And yet, if you go to China, it seems incredibly actively engaged with the supernatural anyway. Temples are immensely lively places with people coming and going. They're like shopping malls, and practices of divination, and the local, every street corner has a temple on it, and so on. And yet religion is not a category that people identify with, partly because the category doesn't fit, and partly because there are political repercussions. Again, you've got a communist legacy playing out there. So when we talk about the rise of no religion, we're talking about very specific historical backgrounds and only certain parts of the world. And I think it helps to think what the historical background was and what people are reacting against when they become non-religious, or in some cases not at all. It's their heritage. It doesn't, being religious doesn't fit it. And it's also worth noting that other world religion majority countries are not becoming non-religious in the way that formerly Christian countries are. We don't see this. Well, we don't know for sure, I think, but some people say that, say, Iraq, there's a Muslim majority country, Friday mosque attendance is very, very low now, but most people still say that they are Muslim or religious, as far as we know. So that's the first point about what type of cultural, political, historical regime are we talking about, and really emphasizing just how important the kind of Christian heritage is when we're talking about no religion usually. And then I have, part of the paper is my findings about the growth of no religion in Britain and who is non-religious. I'm not going to say anything about them. I thought there was an observation I wanted to draw attention to in the paper, which is that the growth of no religion in a country like Britain is interesting because nobody led the movement. It's not an orchestrated cultural change. There weren't champions of no religion. It wasn't even a cultural project like feminism was. So it has grown soul by soul and silently. Individuals making their own choices, and that happening without any kind of collective orchestration. And that makes it culturally very interesting to have reached majority status in that way. And then I give the part of the paper I want to focus on is where I try and explain why this has happened in a formerly Christian country like Britain. And I suggest 4 reasons, and I think they apply to increasingly non-religious Canada and increasingly non-religious USA and many other countries in Europe and Australia and New Zealand, as those liberal democracies elsewhere also. And so my 4 explanations of why we've seen this decline of Christian and growth of no religion are these. One is about more choice. You can call that liberalism as a shorthand, and in some ways there's an ideology and a set of values around that, about the right of the individual to make their own choices. And in some sense, I just mean it that we literally have more cultural choices now because of the media and because of the deregulation of religion, and for lots of reasons: affluence, democracy, consumerism, give people more choice. The churches don't have the cultural monopoly that they once had, and there is no penalty to not going to church or no stigma attached to it. And that's one change. Secondly, I talk about pluralism, a very well rehearsed argument in the sociology of religion, that the more religious and cultural diversity you have, the harder it is for monopolistic and monotheist exclusivist religions to maintain the idea that they have the truth, the only truth, and nothing but the truth. And that's an argument that's long been made, but I think that we're seeing now a new phase of super diversity, which you see very much in terms of identity. This research that you kindly mentioned I've been doing recently with post-millennials, Generation Z, their identities, they identify themselves in terms of 5, 6 characteristics. What their pronoun, their gender is, their sexuality, their romantic orientation, their ethnicity, their fan groups, what they're interested in, what they're majoring in. A whole set of identifications, and each one is a unique kind of package, unique to the person. And so just saying, well, I'm Christian because my parents were Christian, doesn't seem like it's not a very common position to hold, and it might be actually looked down upon. So super diversity in our cultures and in our playing out in identity now. And thirdly, I suggest ideological reasons, again quite well rehearsed, the intellectual objections to Christianity and the idea that there is an all-powerful, all-good being, God, who directs the world. There are many very well-rehearsed objections to that belief, and our cosmology now, influenced by science, has also helped to undermine the idea of the kind of cosmology with a God in charge and a God who made it a smaller universe, if you like, that is often associated with Christianity and Judaism too. And I suggest that I make a hint at this, but I think it's a point worth exploring. I think that actually an awful lot of our values and culture today is a legacy of liberal Protestant Christianity, and yet we don't acknowledge that. We've forgotten. A lot of our values and basic assumptions come from liberal Protestantism and Romanticism, but we have got a very ambivalent attitude to that Christian past. We like to try and forget about it, forget where it comes from. And then finally, my main point in the paper, really, that's why I start by talking about the non-religious funeral becoming the norm, is that when no religion becomes the cultural majority, then sociologically speaking, most people don't make huge choices about most things. We just go along with what's the norm and what's habitual. And so once something becomes the norm, then it becomes really quite odd to be religious, at least in the old packaged religion way. And so it's just normal to have a non-religious funeral, or not to pray, or not to go to church, and it's marked once you say that you are religious. You become the minority then, and that's what happens. So it reinforces the growth of the non-religious. And finally, in my conclusion, I suggest that non-religion I say, is it really anything other than the survey category? Is it a substantive category? And most people say, well, no, not really. And I half agree with that. But again, I use the examples of funerals because it has become a substantive category. People talk about, I want a non-religious funeral. I want a non-religious wedding. I want a non-religious. So it is starting to become a category that people appeal to. But in another sense, it's just, it is very much, it's going back to this point, it's rejecting a certain mode of religion, particularly a monotheistic church-based religion. So the fact that people don't identify with that or with the other world religions on a survey, still it does leave very open what they do and what they say, and then we're back to China. Maybe all we see then in the rise of non-religion is the end of one particular historical mode of religion that looks like a hierarchically organized thing with a god on top, and a reversion to a much more sort of open marketplace where people engage with the supernatural and things like horoscopes and tarot and whatever, which are very much growing amongst these 18 to 25-year-olds, but do it all in their own ways in a much less orchestrated and controlled way. So those are the things that struck me when I looked at the paper again, but I now want to hear what struck you and any thoughts and criticisms and ideas that it provoked in you.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much, Linda. That was a very helpful and insightful overview. So now, as the goal of these sessions is to facilitate discussion, I do invite you now to ask Linda questions. You're also welcome to respond to and make comments with one another. And again, please just indicate this by sending a message to the group chat.
Right, and tell me about your work and the overlaps and areas that you're taking these themes into as well.
Wonderful, thank you. All right.
Lauren, can you tell us how we're supposed to do this? You said something about putting up our hands or something like that, or indicate. I muted my microphone and you didn't stop me.
Yeah, so I can't stop you from unmuting your microphone. So yeah, so you can do that. It's just if lots of people would like to ask questions, there's a group chat box in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. Mm-hmm. So this way people don't end up talking over one another and whatnot. You can just send a message to the chat box. Okay. And that will create somewhat of an order. But Peter, you're obviously welcome to start talking if you have questions or comments you'd like to say.
But of course, professional hazard. Linda, could you speculate? I know it's all speculation. Why now?
I think it's not really now. In Britain, I think it's been happening slowly, steadily for over a century. It's just got to a tipping point now. So, and there doesn't seem to be a big jump at any point. It does seem to be a very, very steady growth literally from one generation to another. Now, that's not true in every country. We can see in the United States, it's happened much more recently and much faster. So I think your question is more pertinent there. And as you well know, some people think it's a reaction to the Christian right. So perhaps where religion becomes very, very, Christianity becomes very, takes a very certain form, a kind of take it or leave it form, a very extreme and clear form, where you have to make a choice for or against Jesus or the political program. Maybe that precipitates people's decision making. And I think that the widespread buy-in to liberal democratic constitutions and values in the post-Second World period plays a role as well in some of these countries, and all the choices we have available to us. So a mixture of some general trends and then some things that are quite specific to different nation states, I think, Peter. But what do you think?
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, it's the old David Martin thing. It depends on where you're talking about. Even the country that I'm most familiar with, which is Canada, the answer to that question is quite different depending on what part of the country you're in. That longer tradition that you talked about that seems to prevail in Great Britain has certainly been a constant feature of the West Coast. And then you have that kind of sudden dropping off the table that is most characteristic of Quebec and to some extent the rest of English Canada. And I ask that question not because I have an answer, because it's a question that I keep on asking myself, to which I can't really find a satisfactory answer other than it happened now.
Well, you made me think, Quebec made me think of Ireland, and that made me think of a general explanation, which may be that people just go along with Christian, even if they're not particularly Christian, if it doesn't offend against anything particularly. But when it suddenly becomes offensive, so in Ireland, once you got the abuse scandals, which were so extreme and terrible in Ireland, you got an incredibly quick dropping off for a very, very clear reason. People were disgusted with how the church had behaved. So, you know, when Christianity, like in Scandinavia, it isn't at all offensive to people, it's just part of the general cultural background, it offers a nice service, people don't bother to become non-religious. In Scandinavia, non-religion is not a big phenomenon. When religion becomes gets very sharp profile, or does something very divisive or bad, then it can happen very quickly.
Linda, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, this is, by the way, this is who's in the room. Hi, everybody. This is the center. I think my question is about, you made the observation that in Britain there was no kind of formal movement, a non-religion movement. But I'm thinking about Dawkins, for example, and the buses and that sort of thing. Is it so? Can you talk about ways in which it was kind of formalized?
There were a few secular societies, but they were always tiny, and they still are. You know, Dawkins has a very tiny number of followers, and I think that Dawkins, that phase was really a reaction to a crisis in secularism rather than religion. Now, I think people like Dawkins thought that the secular elite would continue to be the great thought leaders, and everyone would agree with them, and religion would be eliminated from society. And suddenly it looked like this wasn't happening. And for him, Islam was a really big sign of that. And so there's a crisis of secularism as well as of religion. Organized secularism is really having to shout loud because people aren't dogmatically secular, even if they're non-religious either.
Nice. Thank you. My neighbor here, Ambreen, has a question, I think.
Yeah.
Hi.
I just have a comment about your observations that you are looking at religion on more broader level, like on state level, how government is or people are associating with the religion which is practiced by the nation. But I'm just wondering, don't you think that religion is something very individual, and people would practice it and believe it in their own ways, which is very personal to them, and it doesn't matter what the society is doing? And because there are many ways of practicing the religion, even if you say I'm Christian or I'm Muslim, there would be many, many ways. And it's a very individual kind of thing from my perspective. So, and you mentioned one more thing, that science is developing as such, and the hierarchy that God is on the top. The idea is fading, and we are becoming more and more non-religious. But I would think that human intellect has their own limitations. Science has agreed that we could not find everything that we want to find, and human intellect has its own limitations. So are we just excluding that something is beyond us, that excluding that idea? Are we limiting ourselves? So
these are good questions. I think it's much easier for us. I think religion is, of course, if it's real, it's got to be individual as well as social and meaningful to the individual. But liberal democratic governments have encouraged that idea and made it possible through the idea of freedom of individual religion and conscience religion. So there's no cost to us now in expressing our religious individuality or non-religious individuality. But of course, historically that's not usually the case. There's a very big cost if you live in China, or if you lived in Soviet Russia, or if you live in some certain Muslim countries today. So people will always privately have their own views and whatever, but whether you can express them publicly is very much governed by the state. And I think the way that the state allies itself for or against religion, and what it does in the name of religion, has a very big effect on whether people see religion as a positive force or a negative force as well. was there another question I've missed in what you said there?
About the science and the idea of fading God out and relying on more science.
That's right. So I don't, God hasn't faded out, but a particular sort of God has faded in credibility, I think. So many people still express, not all, but many people still express a belief that there are forces, supernatural forces that are important around us, and more than human forces. They may be ancestors or ghosts or spirits or fate or destiny or the gods of neo-paganism, which is becoming increasingly diverse. So I think it's much greater diversity of supernatural beings and forces and gods, rather than just one God. One vision of God might be fading out, but that doesn't necessarily mean that people give up on belief in supernatural beings. And I think we should pay more attention to the diversity of people's belief in supernatural beings. Actually, it fascinates me. I can see a very interesting question from Jen as well. Is Jen able to say that to us?
Let's see. All right, Jen, would you like to ask your question? Oh, maybe Jen. Let's see.
Okay. Oh, I'm trying to unmute myself.
You managed, and then you turned it back off again.
Okay, I think I unmuted myself. Yeah. I think Corey had a question before me, but I'll turn to him next, maybe. So my question, Linda, was just about I thought of it when you were talking about your data from Ireland, or your response about Ireland, about how folks there, in part, a rejection of religion has to do with controversies around the Catholic Church, around sexual violence and sexual predators. And it really struck me when I read your paper how you spoke about how your informants, their conception of evil, and that how they talked about evil. I don't know if you want me to point out the specific section, but anyway, they talk about evil as being especially centered on sexual predators and terrorists, as kind of like the encapsulation of evil. Right. I thought that was really fascinating, because to me that seems to be kind of part of larger social critiques about religion, that religion is somehow making people irrational so that they can be capable of tremendous violence, or is limiting their sexuality in a way that's really unhealthy or something like that. And so I was just really fascinated about whether you see a correlation between this kind of rejection of religion in how they're understanding evil as well, or whether I've read that too far.
No, I was trying, you haven't, and I'm glad you pursued that, because I need to think about it more, but I was making a sort of Durkheimian point that even if people think that they embrace toleration and pluralism and liberalism, like most people in Britain do, it doesn't mean that they don't set up actually very clear boundaries between what they think is acceptable and true and what they think is false. They don't just become anything goes. And the way you can see that is in what they see as beyond the pale, and evil might be one word they use, but just not acceptable. I mean, for example, today on the news, there's a big story about a British boy who went to fight for ISIS called Jihadi John, who is now imprisoned, being looked after by the Kurds. That's why the issue has come up again. And he's not allowed back into Britain. He's been stripped of his British citizenship because he went to fight for ISIS. And his parents are fighting to have him go to Canada because he's got dual nationality. Have you heard about this guy? So you see, in Britain, my point is, for the British government has made that decision. He's beyond the pale. He's evil. He's done something that's totally unacceptable. He's taken up arms against his own country in the name of a violent regime that is seen as evil. So he's been stripped of citizenship. You haven't stripped of citizenship, but liberal, tolerant democracies do have boundaries of what they think is acceptable and not. That was really the point that I was making. So we haven't lost that just because we think we are liberals now. We've got a different cultural set of what we...
Right. No, I get that. I guess I just wanted to push you a bit on the examples, because it seemed to me that those two examples tend to kind of encapsulate some of the most, like the largest and most important critiques about religion, like why people don't want to be religionists anymore.
Which examples? Explain.
So the two examples that you give as kind of encapsulating how people understand evil are sexual predators and terrorists.
Oh yes,
And so I just wondered, like those really captured my attention as the examples of evil, in that they seem to mirror some of the major critiques around the category of religion, in how religion is somehow getting people to do things that are wrong or something, or that religion protects those kinds of evil. So it just really captured me that
I see. Yes.
Those were the examples.
Yes. Because I think we, if the liberal set of values is about not imposing your values and beliefs on another person, and especially not doing that violently, so not harming, then those sorts of things become the example of evil. They weren't before. I mean, you can see that in the way that the Catholic Church didn't really see sexual predators as evil.
Right.
The Catholic Church defined sin in a very different way. Sin wasn't about violence and harm. Sin was about pride. It was about rebellion against God. So we have definitely changed where we put the boundary between good and evil, but the boundary is still there. And I think you're right. It's extremely interesting to see what is now become evil. But you're making another point, which is really important, which is that religion has, in many people's minds, become a symbol of evil because it is the archetypal place where people impose their beliefs violently on somebody else. So I think that's why Jihadi John is beyond the pale, because he used religion to try and kill and impose his beliefs on other people. That's how those who justify not letting him back in would see it. Whereas in the history of religions, that was seen as absolutely saintly to do that. You were meant to impose your beliefs and convert people. That was fine.
Thank you. Awesome. Thank you, Jen, for your question. Okay, we're going to move over to Corey. You have a question as well.
Hi, Professor Woodhead. I'm specifically interested in the debates about abortion, physician-assisted dying, and same-sex marriage, more specifically physician-assisted dying. You mentioned in your article that most religious nuns support access to this in Britain. So I'm wondering, given that no religion accounts for more than 50% of the population there, do you think it's only a matter of time before current laws change regarding physician-assisted dying? You talk about social norms, and I'm wondering if...
Great question. No, I don't, because there's been a majority in favour of assisted dying in Britain for a long time, and they include Christians. They include Catholics. They include the Church of England members. So the people who oppose it is Parliament. Government after government. For years now, there have been constantly people petitioning to have it accepted, and it is, it's politicians who will not legislate for it. So
that's interesting.
For a very long time.
So then the political and social, I guess more so the political circumstances in the United Kingdom sort of prohibit the social norms from establishing themselves to sort of make it a new norm in the UK. But interestingly, it doesn't
matter if you've got if it's a left-wing government or a right-wing government. They have both rejected the calls to legalise assisted dying.
That's very interesting.
So politicians take a very different view from the majority of people on that. It's a real tension.
No, great. No, thank you for that. That's interesting. I didn't know that.
All right. Awesome. Thanks, Corey. All right. And Megan, you have a question.
Hi, Linda. Thank you so much for this session. So my work is in anti-Semitism in law in Canada. So I had a question related to that, but I had another question pop up while you were talking. My question is, how are religious groups pushing back against, or is there pushback against this growing trend of non-religious identification, I guess, and how so would they be pushing back against this?
That's a great question. They are pushing back in Britain insofar as they're trying to defend their turf. They don't want to give up their historic privilege. And there are lots of, I think this is a great topic for our, for the diversity project, the non-religion project to look at, because I want to look at it in education, which I'm working on with you. So in the schools in Britain, in the school system, there's a historic privilege for religion. Historically Christianity, but it's been extended to Muslims and Jews and whatever. So all those religions are allowed to have state-funded schools, Jewish, Sikh, Hindu, Christian schools. But a lot of parents now say, well, we're non-religious. Why should we have to send our kids? And why should we have to pay our taxes to support these schools? And there's a big legal case coming up at the end of the month with some parents saying they don't want their child to have to sit in a Christian, we have assemblies in the morning, you know, they don't want their child to be exposed to Christian teaching. And the churches are fighting that. They don't want any change in they have a privilege in being allowed to run schools and teach and have worship in schools, and they're fighting really hard to retain that privilege. Mm-hmm. They don't accept that we're a non-religious country. They just think, well, maybe people are, but we're not culturally, and we're still Christian culturally, and we're going to retain our privileges and our other political privileges. So you're right, there is a kind of pushback by clergy, really by the leaders of the churches, more than ordinary people, I think.
Awesome, thanks, Megan. Did you have another question?
It was just more related to, I guess, my work very quickly. So looking at anti-Semitism in Canada, when I'm looking at legal cases, one of the ways, for example, Jews, so that's my focus, would be Jewish people. The Jewish identity does not have to be religious necessarily. There's many atheist Jews, non-religious and cultural and ethnic identities Jews identify with, as opposed to the religious side. So in terms of non-religious, how do labels that kind of go both ways or can be used both ways, I guess, are there, is it strictly non-religious versus religious? Can there be overlap, like with, for example, Jewish identity, I guess, is the way it gets framed and misframed in the cases I'm looking at sometimes. The hate towards Jews, for example, can be very non-religious in motivation.
Yes.
But they're framed as a religious group. So I guess looking at the different nuances, I guess, of identity within a group.
Mm.
Yeah.
I think there are some things that are very specific to anti-Semitism, that aren't generalizable, because anti-Semitism is such an enduring, deep trope and theme, cultural and politically. It just never seems to go away. And as you well know, it takes different forms. Mm-hmm. It changes. Sometimes it's allied to Hinduism. Now it's being increasingly allied to new forms of neo-paganism and heathenism, and it changes its form. But it's a kind of constant that far-right groups are anti-Semitic. And in that way, it's rather different from feeling towards other religions. So I think it differs a bit. I think that's maybe a specific case rather than being able to give a general answer about attitudes towards religion with anti-Semitism.
Okay. Right. Awesome. Thank you, Megan. Okay, and now we have a question from Todd, I believe.
Oh, hang on. No, I've been unmuted.
Hello.
Hi.
My name is Todd Clayman. I'm a historian of China, and I'm from the Chinese University of Hong Kong.
Great.
I'm just a little bit concerned about, I must admit I didn't have the opportunity to read your paper, but I'm listening to your presentation. I was sort of concerned about the way that you were representing China in this conversation. It reminded me quite a bit of the 19th century Western missionaries and Western intellectuals concerned with nationalism and modernity, and their understanding or their exchange with China. And also, for example, I think this question, the idea of world religions, if a person were to have done a survey in China in 1819, asking the question of what category or what religion do people fit into, I think they would get the exact same results that they would get if asking those questions in 2019. Because it's sort of a nonsensical question for people in China. Although there are many Christians, and actually now there's a concern in the Communist Party that their number of Chinese Christians outnumber the members of the Chinese Communist Party. So I'm just wondering if there's a better way to approach it when dealing with China. And one suggestion I have is that if you look at the money that's spent on religious activities, including religious buildings, construction of religious buildings, I think you'd find that China is overwhelmingly religious, and always has been, except for a very short period, of course, during maybe from the 40s to the 70s. But the rest of China's history, you would find a lot of money spent on religion.
Well, Todd, that's just exactly what I say. So I don't think you should have read my paper, because that's really what I say.
Yeah,
I say
I'm sorry I didn't get to you.
The categories that we ask that question of in China just don't apply, and that's why people say they're not religious, except for obviously the officially recognized religions. But on the whole, people don't identify with those world religion categories, but they are obviously very in practice extremely what we would call religious. And so that was a point about why those categories don't work in a country that hasn't got a Christian background. So we're not actually in any disagreement about that.
So how do you bring them into the conversation? Because actually, I would argue that there are a lot of people that identify as, that practice as Buddhists, but would not necessarily answer a questionnaire saying that they were Buddhists.
That's exactly my point. So I end the paper by saying that the decline of the categories, the way they don't work for people anymore, the fact that even in the West people don't identify with the old world religion categories, shows us that we need to rethink the categories of religion, which is, it's an absolute, that's a point that is made again and again and again in the post-colonial literature, that those categories don't apply in places like China. And in fact, places like China are now the ones which can perhaps give us, if people could be imaginative about it, new categories that can illuminate the way that people are neither religious nor secular in a lot of Western countries now, where the categories aren't working. So perhaps the situation, sort of unregulated situation in China, we're perhaps moving closer towards that as well in the countries where the world religions are declining.
Thank you.
There was a question from Peter about in the text box about what arguments do politicians in the UK give for not moving towards the legalization of physician-assisted dying. Their main argument is that it puts too much pressure on physicians, and it's too heavy a decision to give another person to take the life of somebody, and so they don't feel they're in a position to legislate to make other people do that thing. That's their main argument.
Interesting. Not what I would have expected, but there you have it.
On the whole, they try and avoid the whole issue. And that's related to their second argument, which is that they worry that people come under pressure to say they want assisted dying if they're vulnerable people.
All right, thank you. Okay, and Graham, now you have a question about social class.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you very much for your talk. Could you explain Northern Ireland? Part of it. And the long answer then is, you'd mentioned a tipping point in the United Kingdom, but Northern Ireland remains is part of the United Kingdom. And the talk of Catholic Protestant in popular media, as we find it, remains. But is, in your work, is religion still the main driver here, or could it be something else like social class? And I raise social class because there are, could religion have just been a proxy for social class that kept Catholics oppressed for some time? And then there's also concerns from the Protestant working class in Northern Ireland. And just to throw another thing in, the emergence of a Northern Irish identity that is neither the Republic nor the rest of Great Britain. So that's not too many details, but it's a complex topic. So
it is, and you're right. Northern Ireland is an absolutely fascinating case, and I think it's all of the above. I think that in Northern Ireland you get religion is a real force, but so is it's all stuck together with politics and with class and with history and with historic grievances. And it's not one thing or the other. You can't say it's just politics, it's a proxy for religion, or it's just religion, it's a proxy for politics. All those things have been there. And I'll just make one point, because I live in the northwest of England, and in medieval times, I've learnt this from all my medieval historian colleagues, this whole region, northwest England, southern Scotland and Northern Ireland, from about 600-700 AD through to the early modern period, it was all one cultural and ethnic and linguistic region connected by the sea. Cumbria, speaking the same language, and North Wales. So Northern Ireland was always culturally distinct from the rest of Ireland. It's not a new thing. And then there was, it all got tied up then with imperial expansion and later things. But it's an incredibly long and complex case of ethnic, religious, political differences overlaid every century with new issues and so on. But you're right. Northern Ireland is. I say Britain and Great Britain being non-religious because Northern Ireland isn't. It remains religious majority, Christian majority, in a way that Scotland, England, and Wales are not. They're non-religious.
Yeah. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Okay, and Hannah, you have a question as well.
I think I'm unmuted. Let me know if I'm not. Hello, thank you.
Hi.
This
Hi.
is fascinating. I'm studying non-religion within the context of American popular culture, particularly a podcast that's actually treating the Harry Potter series as a sacred text.
Is that Casper took?
Yes, yeah. Casper, Kyle, Vanessa Zoltan.
Right. That's a
yes.
Yeah.
It's so cool. But so what struck me about your paper was how you said that though there's been an overall decline in the number of people who are identifying with a religion or choosing non-religion on censuses and whatnot, we don't see the same decline in beliefs about the afterlife.
Yeah.
That's still sustained. Why do you think that is?
Yep. So in Britain, belief in an afterlife has been growing for several decades. Belief in a soul has been growing, and what's the third one? Angels. Belief in angels have been growing. So and well, interest in magic is very significant, as you well know. Also, I think people are these are just incredibly important and interesting questions, and some people genuinely have. It's got an empirical ground for a lot of people. They experience these things, they'd say, and they're as real as anything else in their life, and they don't need organized religion to think all those things. And in fact, the decline of organized religion makes these things more visible because they become more acceptable again. Maybe they didn't go away, but now they're allowed to be there. One of my interviewees on this post-millennials project told me that she uses, she didn't tell me, she used Harry Potter as almost like a religious text, in the sense that she categorized people in terms of who they were like in Harry Potter, and she used the sort of moral teachings of Harry Potter to guide her, and for her it was like a Bible in that sense, that it gave her a very clear framework for how to reflect on issues in her life. Is that, do you find people using it like that, or is it more, is there a range?
Yes.
Or, yeah?
Yes, absolutely. Actually, in the context of the podcast, they are really encouraging people who listen to the podcast to make their own local groups to do the practice of reading Harry Potter as a sacred text, using different religious practices from other established religions. So they'll take Christian practices and kind of turn them into non-religion practices and apply them to the Harry Potter text.
Like what?
An example would be Lectio Divina, which is an ancient monastic practice that follows 4 different steps to kind of it's seen as getting deeper and deeper into the text, and kind of at the end you're supposed to kind of figure out what God is speaking to you through the text, if that makes sense. And so with this, they'll look at Harry Potter and they'll just pick a random line, and it'll be like, Harry went to go get a cup of water. and they'll sit there and just repeatedly go over and over all of the different words to try and grapple some meaning or some sort of message that the text is trying to give them. And so what I'm noticing is that it tends to be really influenced by Protestant Christianity. And then this is too, I guess, leading to another question I have when studying non-religion is how do we, I feel like we almost need new words or new terms to fully encapsulate the experience of people who identify as non-religious and do religious practice that isn't necessarily religion. And so even the term belief is really problematic because it's just steeped in Christian ideology. And I'm finding this across the board with non-religion articles and books about non-religion, as we are just so stuck in this terminology. And I was wondering if you had any other...
Well, that fits also. Peter's put a really good question here for what are some possible categories for the non-religious that China might be able to offer, because that was a point I made. I've been thinking about this. I mean, I think that, for me, I think that things... areas that are very obvious in China, say, and in India and in Brazil and other places, like healing, divination, fortune telling, hauntings, good and evil hauntings, all those sorts of categories that we use, that anthropologists have used, that you use to try and make sense of people's engagement with the supernatural. We can still apply those in non-religious countries because those categories are still quite full, quite interestingly full, and don't necessarily get looked at enough, I think.
All right, Peter, would you like to respond?
Yes, I've had two students which incited this question, one of whom, well, quite a long time ago, but one of them is Korean, the other one is Chinese. The fellow from China actually tried to develop a typology of religious organization based on the Chinese experience that paralleled the church sect denomination cult one in essentially American sociology religion. And I'm not sure to what degree his ideas are usable, but there's certainly the attempt. And I mean, I could talk about them if you want, but and the other one is that I had the Korean student actually did his PhD thesis on fortune telling in Korea, and both in its organized and what you might call popular culture level, and that of course was also another way of trying to get at this different way that people in that part of the world do what in the West we call religion, to put it indirectly. But that's an ongoing task because it's certainly not easy, and it also suffers from the same problem that the concept of religion does, is that if you invent in this case, English word to describe something that happens in East Asia, and then you transpose that into places outside of East Asia, does it still have the same meaning, and have you actually solved any problems?
Well, there are some things that are easily translatable. It's very interesting that lots of categories of beings of Middle Earth, of the lower Earth, and of the upper sky, there seem to be very similar understandings of those, even though of course we use different words. A jinn for a Muslim, and a spirit, and the way that those operate in terms of how you relate to those, or a demon, or a ghost, or an ancestor, or an elf, a fairy, one of those beings that shares the earth with us but lives down below there. And then the higher gods, the celestial gods, in Chinese religion.
You're moving in the same direction that I'm moving, and that is to go back and find
the vernacular language.
The unity that's the diversity. What is all this stuff about?
Right.
And I mean,
that's right. That's right.
Avoid the word belief and practice. It's cognitive and performative orientations that assume that there are these non-human selectivities out there which are important.
That's right. So going back beyond the academic categories to
Yeah.
It is
an imposition. It's an analytic imposition, but I think as sociologists, most of us are, that we have to do something like that to start this exercise. We have to experiment a little bit with imposing our own categories and see whether that has any purchase in the whole affair.
But that's quite an exciting phase to be in, isn't it? Of having to think about our concepts afresh and try them out and see which ones translate and work and which ones don't. And yeah.
Hannah, did you have a response?
Oh, no. Okay.
Yeah. All right. And we have time for a couple more questions if anyone else has anything.
I suppose that also raises the issue of where you had organized forms of religion that tried to suppress magic, fortune telling, and those other superstitious practices, and then that became reinforced by secular regimes that tried to repress that. So psychologists tried to tell people that hearing voices was a pathology and so on. You know, you've had a secular and religious opposition to a lot of these beliefs and practices. Can that erasure go so far that the practices actually die out? Well, I can tell you the answer here in Northwest England is absolutely not. I'm going to go to a fortune teller next week, and another one, and I had to book 6 months in advance because she's that busy. And I'm going to go to the most haunted hotel in Britain, which is down the road, and gets people to come and stay in it every weekend who want to see a ghost. And so there's still a lot of it around here, but I wonder if that's true everywhere, or if sometimes those beliefs, which are a mixture of very old things and very new media things, I wonder if they ever disappear completely in any countries or not.
I certainly think that those have been very operative categories in the East Asian sphere. As Graham will know, Chinese, I'm mispronouncing it, Mijin, Japanese and Korean have similar kinds of terms of categorizations of, well, bad religion, really. Usually styled in typical kinds as subversive, seditious, deceptive, and all these kinds of things. Those do have a relatively long history in many parts of the world, including, Vanessa, jump in here if you'd like, in various parts of sub-Saharan Africa for an awful longer time than the period of colonialism.
And we inherited that in sociology of religion. You know, Durkheim said magic isn't what we should be looking at.
All right, and let's see, there's a question here about paganism.
Oh yes. Have you found in your UK research any evidence of an approach to the natural world that is not pagan or neo-pagan? Reverential naturalism. Ah, yes. Yes, do you remember that old book, old now, by Catherine Albanese called Nature Religions Today? That's a wonderful history, and it shows just the variety of sacralizations of nature, if you like. And I think you're absolutely right. Paganisms of various sorts have propelled a lot of them forward, but there are other sorts, people who wouldn't call themselves pagan. A lot of people say, it's very common, we see on surveys, you know, where do you experience a sense of something special, supernatural, whatever? Just alone in nature is a very common answer. And there's a guy called David Tyrfel who's looking at that in Sweden as sort of taking over from Christianity, as Sweden's biggest kind of religion is a sort of nature-based one, but not necessarily taking a pagan label. So I think it'd be really interesting, that whole question and area of categorizing, seeing the varieties that there are there.
These are people for whom the category of religion and the category of spirituality both are kind of meh,
exactly.
Don't quite work, and yet they nonetheless quite comfortably speak of a certain kind of transcendent or enchanted or special, unique experience.
Absolutely.
Being out in the natural world. And in British Columbia, there's so much natural world.
And do that with scientists as well. I've seen a lot of people like that. Yeah, needs more work, doesn't it? We're opening up good territory here.
Yeah.
Okay. Awesome. We have time for one more question if there's anyone else who has something they would like to say or respond.
Do the people go to the haunted hotels believe there are ghosts, or is that fun for them? That's exactly what I'm going to try and find out when I go and join them. I think my hypothesis is both. And I think often, but I think religion, I mean, ordinary people's religion is fun. You know, if it's not fun, why bother? Go to Hinduism's a lot of fun. And when religion stops being fun, I think people stop doing it. So I don't think there's a big line between being entertained and really believing in it. I think a lot of people, I find this in fortune telling that I go to more and more, it's often very social. People go to fortune tellers in parties and they have a drink and they have a laugh and they say that fortune teller wasn't very good, and then they'd say this is ridiculous what they said, but then they really believe some bits of it. So it's a kind of mixture of both.
Okay, thanks.
Awesome, thanks Ryan. Okay, so that's a fun note to end everything on. Wonderful, so thank you so much everyone for your participation. This was really engaging. So again, I thank you for joining us, and Linda, especially a big thank you to you for sharing your time and expertise with us.
I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So thank you everyone, and keep an eye out for emails regarding future Meet the Author sessions. There'll be many more.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks for hosting it.
Thank you.